The autumn leaves crunched beneath Detective Rachel Torres' boots as she walked up the gravel driveway of the modest ranch house in Cedar Falls, Montana. 24 years had passed since 15-year-old Emma Whitmore vanished without a trace from this very property. And now, in October 2023, she was finally getting the call she'd been waiting for her entire career. Harold Whitmore, Emma's stepfather, was ready to talk. The case had haunted the small farming community since 1999. Emma, a bright sophomore at Cedar Falls High School, had gone to spend the weekend at her family's country house 30 miles outside town. She was supposed to return Sunday evening for school the next day, but Monday morning came and went with no sign of her. When her mother, Linda, couldn't reach either Emma or Harold by phone, she drove out to the property herself, only to find Harold alone and claiming Emma had left early Sunday morning to visit a friend. Before we continue with this incredible story, I want to ask you to subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. These real-life mysteries need to be shared and remembered. Also, please let us know in the comments where you're watching from around the world. Your support helps us bring these important stories to light. The initial investigation in 1999 had been frustratingly brief. Harold maintained his story that Emma had decided to leave early, taking some of her belongings with her. The local sheriff's department, understaffed and dealing with what seemed like a typical runaway case, conducted only a cursory search of the property. Emma's backpack and some clothes were missing, which seemed to support Harold's account. Her mother, Linda, desperate and growing suspicious, hired a private investigator, but after 6 months with no leads, the money ran out. What made the case particularly troubling was the family dynamics. Harold had married Linda when Emma was 12, and neighbors had always commented on the tension in the household. Emma, who had been close to her deceased father, struggled to accept her new stepfather. Teachers at school noted that her grades had declined since Harold entered their lives, and she'd confided to friends that she didn't feel comfortable at home anymore. Linda Whitmore had spent years torn between believing her husband and trusting her maternal instincts. She'd noticed changes in Harold's behavior after that October weekend. He became more withdrawn, started drinking heavily, and insisted they sell the country house. When Linda refused, their marriage began to crumble. They divorced in 2003, and Linda moved to Denver, never giving up hope that Emma would return. Detective Torres had inherited the cold case file when she transferred to Cedar Falls 5 years ago. Unlike her predecessors, she'd grown up in a small town and understood the dynamics of close-knit communities where secrets could fester for decades. She'd made it her mission to review every unsolved disappearance in the county, and Emma's case stood out for several reasons that previous investigators had overlooked. Harold Whitmore was now 68 years old, living alone in the same house where Emma had last been seen. His health was failing. He'd been diagnosed with emphysema from decades of smoking, and his doctor had given him less than a year to live. It was this prognosis that finally prompted his phone call to the sheriff's department. "I need to tell someone what really happened," he'd said in a voice barely above a whisper. As Detective Torres approached the front door, she noticed the property's state of decay. The barn that had once housed Harold's small cattle operation was leaning precariously, its red paint faded to rust. The fields that had once been planted with corn and soybeans were now overgrown with weeds. Harold's white pickup truck, the same one he'd owned in 1999, sat in the driveway with flat tires and a spider web of cracks across the windshield. Harold answered the door before Torres could knock. He was a shadow of the man she'd seen in old photographs from the investigation files. His once broad shoulders were now hunched. His thick brown hair had gone completely grey and thin, and his hands shook as he gestured for her to come inside. The house smelled of cigarette smoke and neglect. Newspapers from weeks past were stacked on every surface, and dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight, streaming through dirty windows. "Thank you for coming," Harold said, settling into a worn recliner that had clearly been his primary residence for years. I know Linda deserves to know what happened to her daughter. I should have told the truth a long time ago." Torres set up her recording equipment on the coffee table, noting how Harold's eyes kept darting toward the kitchen window that faced the old barn. "Harold, I need to inform you that anything you say can be used in a legal proceeding. Do you understand that?" "I understand," he replied, his voice hoarse from years of smoking. "I'm dying anyway. The cancer's spread to my lungs and liver. I don't have long, and I can't take this secret with me." The detective leaned forward, her heart racing with anticipation. After 24 years, Emma's family might finally get answers. "Tell me what happened that October weekend in 1999. Harold closed his eyes and took a shuddering breath. When he opened them again, tears were streaming down his weathered cheeks. "Emma didn't leave early Sunday morning like I told everyone. She never left the property at all. And the afternoon sun was beginning to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the abandoned fields. Detective Torres felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather as she prepared to hear the truth that had been buried for nearly a quarter century. Outside, a murder of crows took flight from the bare branches of an old oak tree, their caws echoing across the empty landscape like ghosts from the past. Harold's confession began with the events of that Friday evening in October 1999. Emma had been particularly defiant during the drive to the country house, angry that her mother had insisted she spend the weekend there instead of attending a homecoming dance at school. "She blamed me for everything," Harold said, his voice barely audible. "For her parents' divorce, for her father's death, for her mother having to work 2 jobs. None of it was fair, but I understood why she needed someone to blame." The weekend had started typically enough. Harold worked on repairing a section of fence that had been damaged by cattle, while Emma stayed inside, sulking and talking on the phone with friends. Saturday evening, they'd eaten dinner in uncomfortable silence, the tension in the small kitchen thick enough to cut with a knife. Emma had asked multiple times when they could go back to town, and Harold had repeatedly told her they weren't leaving until Sunday afternoon, as planned. "That's when everything changed," Harold continued, reaching for a glass of water with trembling hands. "Emma accused me of keeping her there on purpose, said I was trying to control her life, just like I controlled her mother's. She started screaming at me, saying things that hurt more than she could know. I'd been trying so hard to be a good stepfather, but she made it clear I'd never be anything more than an intruder in her family." Torres noticed that Harold's account was becoming more detailed and emotional. This wasn't the rehearsed story of an innocent man. This was the painful unburdening of someone who had carried guilt for decades. "What happened next, Harold?" "She said she was going to call her mother and tell her I'd been inappropriate with her." Harold's voice cracked. "It wasn't true, Detective Torres. I never ever touched that girl inappropriately. But I knew that in a small town like Cedar Falls, even the accusation would destroy my life. I'd lose my job at the grain elevator, lose my home, lose everything I'd worked for." The room fell silent, except for the ticking of an old mantel clock. Torres could see that Harold was struggling with the next part of his story. She'd interviewed enough people over the years to recognize the moment when someone reaches the point of no return in their confession. "I panicked," Harold whispered. "I grabbed her arm to stop her from going to the phone, and she fell backward, hit her head on the corner of the kitchen counter. There was so much blood, Detective. She wasn't moving, wasn't breathing. I checked for a pulse, tried to wake her up, but she was gone." Torres felt her stomach drop. After all these years of wondering what had happened to Emma, the truth was far simpler and more tragic than anyone had imagined. "What did you do then?" Harold was openly weeping now, his body shaking with sobs that had been building for 24 years. "I should have called an ambulance, should have called the police, but I was terrified. A 15-year-old girl dies in my house after accusing me of touching her. Who would believe it was an accident? I would have been charged with murder, and Linda would have lost everything too. The detective pressed for more details about what happened to Emma's body. Harold led her through his decision-making process that terrible Saturday night. He'd wrapped Emma in a blanket and carried her out to the barn, where he'd spent hours digging a grave in the dirt floor near the back corner. He'd buried her along with her backpack and the clothes she'd brought for the weekend, creating the illusion that she'd taken them with her when she left. "I practiced my story all night," Harold admitted. "How I'd tell Linda that Emma had gotten a call from a friend early Sunday morning and decided to get a ride back to town. I even messed up her bed to make it look like she'd slept in it and then made it before leaving. I thought I'd covered everything." But Harold's deception had required constant vigilance. Every time Linda wanted to involve more police in the search, he'd discourage her, suggesting that Emma was probably just staying with friends and would come home when she was ready. When the private investigator Linda hired wanted to expand the search to include the barn and outbuildings, Harold claimed he'd already searched them thoroughly. "The worst part was watching Linda grieve," Harold said, staring out the window toward the barn where Emma's remains had been hidden for over 2 decades. "She never gave up hope that Emma would come home. She kept Emma's room exactly the same for years, always set an extra place at Christmas dinner, never stopped believing her daughter was alive somewhere." Detective Torres asked about Harold's state of mind in the years following Emma's disappearance. He described a life consumed by guilt and paranoia. Every knock on the door could be police with new evidence. Every time construction crews worked near the property, he worried they might accidentally discover Emma's grave. He started drinking heavily, which contributed to the breakdown of his marriage to Linda. "I wanted to confess so many times," Harold said, "especially when Linda and I were getting divorced. She blamed herself, thought she was a bad mother for not being able to protect Emma or find her. I came close to telling her the truth then, but I was a coward. I convinced myself that telling her would only make things worse." The interview continued as daylight faded outside. Harold provided specific details about the location of Emma's grave, 6 feet from the back wall of the barn, 3 feet from the corner post, buried approximately 4 feet deep. He'd marked the spot in his mind by its proximity to a distinctive knot in one of the barn's support beams. Torres asked about Harold's decision to finally come forward. He explained that his terminal diagnosis had forced him to confront his mortality and the weight of his secret. "I realized I was going to die knowing that Linda spent her whole life wondering what happened to her daughter. Emma deserves a proper burial, and Linda deserves to know the truth, even if it destroys whatever memory she has of me." As the official interview concluded, Torres felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Emma's disappearance would finally be solved, but the resolution brought no joy, only the tragic reality of a life cut short by a moment of panic and bad decisions that had snowballed into decades of deception. The next morning, a team of forensic investigators arrived at Harold's property with ground-penetrating radar and excavation equipment. Harold, despite his failing health, insisted on being present as they worked. The barn, which had stood as a silent monument to his secret for 24 years, was about to give up its hidden truth. Detective Torres coordinated with the medical examiner's office and made the difficult phone call to Linda Whitmore in Denver. Linda, now 57 years old and working as a nurse at Denver General Hospital, had never remarried and had devoted much of her free time to missing persons advocacy. When Torres explained that Harold had confessed and they believed they'd found Emma's remains, Linda's reaction was a complex mixture of grief, relief, and rage. "I always knew he was lying," Linda said through tears during their phone conversation. "A mother knows when someone isn't telling the truth about her child. I just never imagined, I never thought he would hurt her." The excavation began in the exact location Harold had described. The forensic team worked methodically, documenting every layer of soil and debris. Harold sat in a folding chair nearby, his oxygen tank hissing softly, watching as decades of deception were literally unearthed. By late afternoon, they'd found the first piece of evidence, a fragment of the blue blanket Harold had described. As the team continued digging, they uncovered Emma's remains, along with her backpack and the clothes she'd brought for that fateful weekend. The medical examiner would later confirm that the evidence was consistent with Harold's account of events. Emma had died from blunt force trauma to the head, and the angle of the injury supported his claim that she'd fallen backward and struck the kitchen counter. Linda arrived from Denver the following day, accompanied by her sister and a grief counselor from the Victim Services Unit. Torres met them at the sheriff's department, where Linda would have the opportunity to confront Harold if she chose to. The meeting was arranged in the department's family conference room, with Torres and a prosecutor present as witnesses. Harold, connected to a portable oxygen machine and clearly weakened by the stress of the past few days, struggled to make eye contact with his ex-wife. "Linda, I'm so sorry," he began, but she cut him off with a gesture. "Don't," she said firmly. "Don't apologize to me. You took my daughter away from me and then let me spend 24 years thinking she might walk through my door someday. You watched me destroy myself with worry and hope, and you said nothing." The confrontation lasted nearly an hour. Linda demanded to know every detail of Emma's final hours, wanted to understand how Harold could have lived with himself all these years, needed to hear him acknowledge the magnitude of what his deception had cost her. Harold answered every question, no matter how painful, accepting full responsibility for his actions. "I know you can never forgive me," Harold said, as the meeting neared its end. "I don't expect you to. But I want you to know that not a single day passed that I didn't think about Emma and what I'd done. The guilt almost killed me a dozen times over the years." Linda's response was measured and devastating. "The guilt should have killed you, Harold. My daughter deserved better than dying alone in your kitchen and being buried like an animal in your barn. She deserved a mother who knew where she was, who could visit her grave, who could properly mourn her death instead of living in limbo for 24 years. Harold died 6 weeks later, never making it to trial. The prosecutor had been preparing charges of involuntary manslaughter and abuse of a corpse, but Harold's confession and cooperation in recovering Emma's body influenced the decision not to pursue the case aggressively against a dying man. His death certificate listed emphysema as the primary cause, but those who knew him believed he died of a broken heart and decades of accumulated guilt. Emma's funeral took place on a cold December morning in Cedar Falls, 24 years after her disappearance. The service drew hundreds of people, former classmates who were now adults with children of their own, teachers who had never forgotten their missing student, and community members who had followed the case since 1999. Linda had chosen to bury Emma next to her biological father in the town cemetery, finally bringing her daughter home. Detective Torres attended the funeral, standing in the back as Linda delivered a eulogy that captured both her grief and her gratitude for finally having answers. "Emma was 15 years old when she died," Linda said, her voice carrying across the silent crowd. "She should have graduated from high school, gone to college, fallen in love, had children of her own. Instead, she spent 24 years in a grave that no one could visit, mourned by people who didn't even know she was dead." In the months following Emma's burial, Linda became a powerful advocate for missing persons cases and the importance of thorough initial investigations. She established the Emma Whitmore Foundation, which provides resources for families of missing children and funds training for law enforcement officers in small communities. Linda often speaks at conferences about the devastating impact of unresolved cases, not just on families, but on entire communities. The country house where Emma died was demolished at Linda's request. Harold had left the property to the county in his will, with instructions that it be sold and the proceeds donated to missing children charities. Linda couldn't bear the thought of another family living where her daughter had spent her final moments, so the county agreed to raise the buildings and convert the land to a memorial park. Detective Torres continues to work cold cases in Cedar Falls, carrying with her the lesson that persistent investigation and compassionate interviewing can sometimes unlock secrets that have been buried for decades. Emma's case became a model for how small-town departments can effectively handle missing persons investigations, emphasizing the importance of treating every disappearance seriously from the beginning. The story of Emma Whitmore's disappearance and the 24-year wait for truth serves as a powerful reminder that secrets, no matter how deeply buried, have a way of eventually surfacing. Harold's deathbed confession brought closure to a case that had haunted a community for nearly a quarter-century, but it also highlighted the ripple effects of tragedy and deception on everyone involved. Today, a small memorial garden marks the spot where Harold's country house once stood. Linda visits several times a year, not to remember the place where Emma died, but to celebrate the place where the truth finally emerged. In the center of the garden stands a simple granite stone with Emma's name and dates, along with an inscription that reads, "Beloved daughter, never forgotten, finally at peace." Today, the case files from Emma's disappearance and eventual discovery are now part of the curriculum at the State Police Academy, teaching future investigators about the importance of persistence, the complexity of family dynamics in missing persons cases, and the healing power of truth even when it comes too late for those who suffer waiting for it. Rewrite and achieve every requirement I asked. You didn't achieve everything. Rewrite and achieve every requirement I asked. You didn't achieve everything. The autumn leaves crunched beneath Detective Maria Castellanos' boots as she walked up the gravel driveway of the modest ranch house in Cedar Falls, Montana. 24 years had passed since 15-year-old Jessica Brennan vanished without a trace from this very property. And now, in October 2023, she was finally getting the call she'd been waiting for her entire career. William "Bill" Garrett, Jessica's stepfather, was ready to talk. The case had haunted the small farming community since that crisp October weekend in 1999. Jessica, a bright sophomore at Cedar Falls High School with dreams of becoming a veterinarian, had gone to spend the weekend at her family's country house 30 miles outside town. She was supposed to return Sunday evening for school the next day, but Monday morning came and went with no sign of her. When her mother, Patricia, couldn't reach either Jessica or Bill by phone, she drove out to the property herself through the winding mountain roads that connected their small town to the rural homestead. What she found there would begin a mystery that would consume her life for the next 2 decades. Before we continue with this incredible story that shook an entire community to its core, I want to ask you to subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. These real-life mysteries of ordinary families torn apart by tragedy need to be shared and remembered. Also, please let us know in the comments where you're watching from around the world. Your support helps us bring these important stories to light, and hearing from our viewers reminds us why these cases matter so much to the families still searching for answers. Bill was alone at the property when Patricia arrived that October evening in 1999, claiming that Jessica had decided to leave early Sunday morning after receiving a phone call from her best friend, Ashley Martinez. According to Bill's account, Jessica had packed her things hurriedly and asked him to drive her to the main highway where Ashley's older brother would pick her up. He said he'd dropped her off around 7 in the morning and watched her get into a red pickup truck before returning to finish his weekend chores at the property. But when Patricia called Ashley's family, they had no idea what she was talking about. Ashley had been at home all weekend, helping her grandmother with fall canning, and her brother didn't even own a red truck. The initial investigation in 1999 had been frustratingly brief and poorly handled by the understaffed Clearwater County Sheriff's Department. Sheriff Roy Henderson, who had held the position for nearly 30 years, was more accustomed to dealing with cattle theft and drunk driving incidents than potential kidnappings or foul play. The department consisted of Henderson, 2 deputies, and a part-time dispatcher who worked out of a cramped office above the town's only hardware store. When Patricia reported Jessica missing, Henderson's first assumption was that they were dealing with a typical teenage runaway situation, despite the family's insistence that Jessica would never disappear voluntarily. The cursory search of the Garrett property lasted only 6 hours and focused primarily on the areas immediately surrounding the house. Bill had been cooperative, even helpful, pointing out places where Jessica liked to walk and offering to assist in the search. Some of Jessica's clothes were missing from her weekend bag, along with her favorite denim jacket and the small silver locket she always wore, a gift from her deceased father. These missing items seemed to support Bill's story that Jessica had left willingly, taking personal belongings with her. Henderson's report noted that there were no signs of struggle in the house or surrounding buildings, and that Bill appeared genuinely concerned about his stepdaughter's welfare. What made the case particularly troubling was the complex family dynamics that had been brewing beneath the surface for years. Bill had married Patricia when Jessica was 11 years old, just 2 years after her father David's death in a construction accident. David Brennan had been beloved in the community, a volunteer firefighter and Little League coach who had left behind not only a wife and daughter, but an entire town that mourned his loss. Bill, who had moved to Cedar Falls from Billings to work as a mechanic at the county's road maintenance facility, was an outsider trying to fill the shoes of a local hero. Jessica had never fully accepted her stepfather, a fact that hadn't gone unnoticed by her teachers, friends, and extended family. Mrs. Dorothy Henley, Jessica's 8th grade English teacher, later told investigators that she had observed changes in the girl's behavior and academic performance after Bill joined the family. Jessica, who had been an A student, began turning in assignments late and seemed distracted during class. She had confided to her guidance counselor, Mr. Robert Hayes, that she felt like a stranger in her own home and missed the easy relationship she'd had with her mother before the remarriage. The tension had escalated as Jessica entered high school and began asserting more independence. Patricia found herself constantly mediating between her daughter and her new husband, both of whom seemed determined to prove the other was the problem. Bill complained that Jessica was disrespectful and manipulative, while Jessica accused him of trying to control every aspect of her life. The arguments had become so frequent and intense that Patricia had suggested family counseling, but both Jessica and Bill had refused to participate. Patricia Brennan had spent years torn between believing her husband and trusting her maternal instincts that something wasn't right about Jessica's disappearance. In the weeks following that October weekend, she noticed subtle changes in Bill's behavior that troubled her. He had always been a social drinker, but now he was consuming a 6-pack of beer every night after work, often sitting in silence on the back porch, staring out toward the barn and storage buildings. When Patricia suggested they hire a private investigator to supplement the sheriff's lackluster efforts, Bill discouraged the idea, arguing that it would be a waste of money, since Jessica would probably come home on her own when she was ready. The private investigator Patricia eventually hired against Bill's wishes was a retired police detective named Frank Delacroix, who had moved to Montana from Chicago after 30 years on the force. Delacroix immediately identified several problems with the initial investigation, including the failure to thoroughly search all the outbuildings on the Garrett property and the lack of any attempt to verify Bill's story about dropping Jessica off at the highway. However, after 6 months of investigation that drained the family's modest savings account, Delacroix had found no concrete evidence to contradict Bill's version of events. The case went cold, leaving Patricia with nothing but questions and a growing suspicion that her husband knew more than he was telling. Detective Maria Castellanos had inherited the Emma Whitmore cold case file when she transferred to the Clearwater County Sheriff's Department 5 years ago as part of a state initiative to bring experienced investigators to understaffed rural departments. Unlike her urban colleagues, Castellanos understood the unique challenges of policing in small communities where everyone knew everyone else's business, and where family secrets could fester for generations before coming to light. She had made it her personal mission to review every unsolved case in the county files, paying particular attention to disappearances and suspicious deaths that might have been inadequately investigated due to resource constraints or assumptions about rural crime patterns. Jessica's case had immediately caught Castellanos' attention for several reasons that previous investigators had either overlooked or failed to pursue. The timeline of events that Bill described didn't align with the known habits and personality of a 15-year-old girl who had never been in trouble and had never previously run away from home. Jessica's bank account, which contained nearly $300 from her part-time job at the local feed store, had never been accessed. Her social security number had never been used for employment, and there were no records of her enrolling in school anywhere in the country. Most tellingly, Jessica had never made any attempt to contact her mother, her friends, or her beloved grandmother, Ruth, who had raised Patricia, and with whom Jessica had maintained a close relationship throughout the upheaval of her mother's remarriage. Bill Garrett was now 66 years old, living alone in the same house where Jessica had last been seen alive. His health had been declining rapidly over the past year. Emphysema from 4 decades of smoking had progressed to the point where he required supplemental oxygen, and recent medical tests had revealed aggressive lung cancer that his doctors estimated would give him less than 6 months to live. It was this terminal diagnosis that had finally prompted his phone call to the sheriff's department on a grey October morning that mirrored the weather from that fateful weekend in 1999. "I need to tell someone what really happened to Jessica," he had said, in a voice barely above a whisper, made even more fragile by the breathing difficulties that now plagued him constantly. "I can't take this secret with me to the grave. Patricia deserves to know the truth about her daughter, even if it destroys whatever she might still think of me." As Detective Castellanos approached the front door of the weathered farmhouse, she couldn't help but notice how the property had deteriorated over the years. The barn that had once housed Bill's small cattle operation was leaning precariously, its red paint faded to the color of dried blood. The fields that had once been planted with hay and winter wheat were now overgrown with thistle and prairie grass. Bill's white Ford pickup truck, the same one he'd claimed to have used to drive Jessica to the highway in 1999, sat in the driveway with flat tires and a spider web of cracks across the windshield, as if it hadn't moved in years. Bill answered the door before Castellanos could knock, as if he had been waiting by the window watching for her arrival. He was a shadow of the man she had seen in old photographs from the investigation files. His once broad shoulders were now hunched and frail, his thick brown hair had gone completely grey and thin, and his hands shook as he gestured for her to come inside while dragging an oxygen tank behind him. The house smelled of cigarette smoke and neglect, with newspapers from weeks past stacked on every surface and dust motes dancing in the afternoon sunlight that struggled through dirty windows. "Thank you for coming, Detective," Bill said, settling into a worn recliner that had clearly become his primary residence. "I know Patricia has suffered enough over the years, wondering what happened to Jessica. She deserves to know the truth, even if it comes too late for her to have any peace from it. Castellanos set up her recording equipment on the coffee table between them, noting how Bill's eyes kept darting toward the kitchen window that provided a clear view of the old barn and storage buildings. She could sense the weight of whatever secret he had been carrying for nearly a quarter-century, and the relief and terror he was feeling at finally being ready to unburden himself. "Bill, before we begin, I need to inform you that anything you say during this interview can be used as evidence in a legal proceeding," Castellanos said in her most professional tone. "You have the right to have an attorney present, and you can stop this interview at any time. Do you understand these rights as I've explained them to you?" "I understand completely," he replied, his voice hoarse from years of smoking and now made weaker by his illness. "I don't need a lawyer, detective. I'm dying anyway, and I've lived with this guilt for 24 years. I need to tell someone what really happened that weekend, not to save myself, but to give Patricia the closure she's been denied for far too long." The detective leaned forward slightly, her heart racing with the anticipation that had been building throughout her 5-year review of this case. After more than 2 decades of mystery and speculation, Jessica's family might finally get the answers they had been desperately seeking. "Tell me what happened during that October weekend in 1999, Bill. Start from the beginning and take your time." Bill closed his eyes and took several shallow breaths through his oxygen mask before removing it and looking directly at Castellanos for the first time since she had arrived. When he opened his eyes again, tears were streaming down his weathered and deeply lined cheeks. "Jessica didn't leave early Sunday morning like I told Patricia and the sheriff. She never left the property at all, detective. She died here, in this house, and I've been living with that terrible secret ever since." The afternoon sun was beginning to set behind the Rocky Mountain foothills that surrounded Cedar Falls, casting long shadows across the abandoned fields and giving the entire property an otherworldly appearance. Detective Castellanos felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather, as she prepared to hear the truth that had been buried for nearly a quarter-century. Outside the kitchen window, a murder of crows took flight from the bare branches of an old cottonwood tree, their harsh caws echoing across the empty landscape like voices from the past demanding justice for a 15-year-old girl whose life had been cut tragically short. Bill's confession began with the events of that Friday evening in October 1999, when he and Jessica had made the 30-mile drive from Cedar Falls to the family's country property in uncomfortable silence. Jessica had been particularly angry about being forced to spend the weekend there instead of attending the homecoming dance at Cedar Falls High School, where she had been looking forward to dancing with Tommy Rodriguez, a senior who had finally asked her out after months of flirtation in their shared chemistry class. The dance represented more than just a social event to Jessica. It was a symbol of her growing independence and her emerging identity as a young woman separate from the family conflicts that had dominated her teenage years. "She spent the entire drive telling me how much she hated me and how I had ruined her life and her mother's life," Bill said, his voice growing stronger as he began to unburden himself of the secret that had consumed him for over 2 decades. "She said that her real father would never have forced her to miss something so important, and that if he were still alive, her mother would never have married someone like me." It wasn't the first time she'd said these things, but there was something different about her anger that night. It was more focused, more adult somehow. The weekend had started with the usual tension that characterized most of their interactions. Bill worked on repairing a section of fence that had been damaged when a neighbor's cattle had wandered onto the property, while Jessica remained inside the house, alternating between sulking in her temporary bedroom and making increasingly frustrated phone calls to her friends about missing the dance. She had brought her homework with her, as was the family rule for weekend trips to the country house, but Bill could see through the windows that she was spending more time staring out at the mountains than working on her assignments. Saturday had passed uneventfully, with both of them maintaining a careful distance and speaking only when necessary. Jessica helped prepare dinner, a simple meal of hamburgers and canned corn, but ate in silence while Bill tried to make conversation about her school activities and future plans. He had genuinely wanted to connect with his stepdaughter, despite their troubled relationship, and had hoped that the quiet weekend might provide an opportunity for them to find some common ground away from Patricia's anxious attempts to mediate between them. "I really was trying to be a good stepfather," Bill continued, reaching for his oxygen mask to take several deep breaths before continuing his story. "I knew I could never replace her real father, and I wasn't trying to. I just wanted her to understand that I cared about her and wanted what was best for her, even if my way of showing it wasn't what she needed or wanted." A Saturday evening had passed quietly, with Jessica talking on the phone with her friends until nearly midnight, while Bill watched television and worked on a woodworking project he had brought along to keep himself occupied. They had said goodnight to each other civilly, and Bill had gone to bed, believing that perhaps they were making some progress toward a more peaceful coexistence. Sunday morning, however, had shattered any illusions he might have had about their improving relationship. She came into the kitchen around 8 o'clock Sunday morning, already dressed and with her bag packed, Bill recalled, his hands now shaking so badly that he had difficulty holding his water glass. She announced that she was calling her mother to come pick her up immediately because she refused to spend another minute alone with me. When I asked her what was wrong, she exploded. The argument that followed had been unlike any of their previous conflicts. Jessica accused Bill of deliberately keeping her isolated at the country house so he could try things with her, using language and making accusations that shocked him both with their explicitness and their complete lack of basis in reality. She threatened to tell her mother, her friends, and anyone else who would listen that her stepfather was a pervert who couldn't be trusted alone with teenage girls. "It wasn't true, Detective Castellanos," Bill said, his voice breaking with emotion. "I swear on my dying breath that I never, ever touched that girl inappropriately. I never even thought about her in that way. She was my wife's daughter, and I was trying to be a father figure to her, nothing more. But I knew that in a town like Cedar Falls, even the accusation would destroy my life completely." The detective had interviewed enough people over her career to recognize the difference between a calculated lie and the desperate truth-telling of someone unburdening their conscience. Bill's anguish appeared genuine, and his account had the kind of specific, painful details that were difficult to fabricate convincingly. "What happened next?" Castellanos asked gently, knowing that she was approaching the crucial moment in Bill's confession. "I panicked," Bill whispered, his voice barely audible above the hiss of his oxygen tank. "I tried to stop her from going to the phone to call Patricia. I grabbed her arm, not to hurt her, but just to make her stop and listen to me. I wanted to convince her that we could work this out, that she didn't need to destroy both of our lives over something that had never happened and never would happen." Bill paused, struggling with both his breathing and his emotions as he approached the most difficult part of his story. She jerked away from me violently, lost her balance, and fell backward. Her head hit the corner of the kitchen counter with this terrible sound that I'll never forget as long as I live. There was blood immediately, more blood than I'd ever seen from a head injury, and she wasn't moving or making any sound at all. The detective felt her stomach tighten as she realized that after 24 years of mystery and speculation, the truth about Jessica's disappearance was tragically simple. "Did you check for signs of life? Did you attempt CPR or call for emergency services?" "I checked for a pulse, tried to wake her up, even attempted mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, but she was already gone," Bill said, openly weeping now with sobs that seemed to come from the deepest part of his soul. "I should have called an ambulance immediately, should have called the sheriff, should have done what any normal person would do in that situation." But I was terrified, Detective. A 15-year-old girl had just died in my kitchen after accusing me of sexual impropriety. Who in their right mind would believe that it was a complete accident? Castellanos pressed gently for more details about Bill's actions in the hours following Jessica's death. He described a state of panic and denial that had lasted well into Sunday evening, during which he had alternated between sitting beside Jessica's body and pacing frantically around the house, trying to figure out what to do. He had considered calling the authorities dozens of times, but kept imagining how the story would sound to investigators, prosecutors, and eventually a jury of his peers. "I kept thinking about how it would look," Bill explained, his breathing becoming more labored as the emotional stress took its toll on his compromised respiratory system. A stepfather who had a troubled relationship with his teenage stepdaughter, alone with her at an isolated property, her body found with a head injury after she'd threatened to accuse him of sexual abuse. Even if they believed it was an accident, my life in Cedar Falls would be over. Patricia would lose her job at the bank because of the scandal, and we'd have to leave town in disgrace. As Sunday evening approached, and Patricia would be expecting them to return home, Bill made the desperate decision to hide Jessica's death and create an elaborate cover story. He wrapped her body in a blanket from her bedroom and carried her out to the barn, where he spent most of Sunday night digging a grave in the dirt floor near the back corner, using hand tools to avoid the noise that power equipment might make in the quiet mountain air. "I buried her, along with her bag and the clothes she'd brought for the weekend," Bill said, his voice now barely a whisper. "I even buried that silver locket she always wore, the one her real father had given her for her 13th birthday. I wanted to create the impression that she had taken her personal belongings with her when she left, so no one would think to look for her body on the property. The deception had required careful attention to detail and constant vigilance." Bill had spent hours that Sunday night rehearsing his story about driving Jessica to the highway to meet her friend's brother, even going so far as to drive his truck to the location he described and back again to put the appropriate mileage on the odometer. He had disturbed Jessica's bed to make it appear that she had slept in it and then made it before leaving, and he had even prepared explanations for any questions about timing or logistics that might arise during questioning. But Bill's cover-up had required him to deceive not only law enforcement, but also his wife, whose grief and desperation over Jessica's disappearance had been heartbreaking to witness. "The worst part of all of this was watching Patricia suffer," Bill said, tears flowing freely down his cheeks. "She never gave up hope that Jessica would come home someday. She kept Jessica's bedroom exactly the same for years, always made Jessica's favorite foods on her birthday, never stopped believing that her daughter was alive somewhere and would eventually contact her." Patricia's unwavering hope and her determination to keep searching for Jessica had created additional challenges for Bill's deception. Every time she wanted to expand the search efforts, hire additional investigators, or bring in specialized search teams, he had to find ways to discourage her without seeming unsupportive of the effort to find his stepdaughter. When Patricia suggested offering a reward for information about Jessica's whereabouts, Bill worried that it might encourage someone to come forward with false information that could eventually expose his lie. "I had to watch my wife destroy herself with guilt and worry for years," Bill continued, his voice filled with self-loathing. "She blamed herself for not being a better mother, for not recognizing signs that Jessica was planning to run away, for not protecting her daughter from whatever fate had befallen her. Every Mother's Day, every Christmas, every birthday was torture for Patricia, and I was the one responsible for her suffering." Detective Castellanos asked about the impact of Jessica's disappearance on Bill's relationship with Patricia and his mental state in the years that followed. He described a marriage that had slowly crumbled under the weight of grief, suspicion, and his own guilt-driven behavior changes. He had started drinking heavily, partly to numb the constant anxiety about being discovered, and partly to cope with watching his wife's anguish over their lost daughter. Patricia started to suspect that I wasn't telling her everything, Bill admitted. She never accused me directly, but I could see it in her eyes sometimes when she looked at me. She knew I was hiding something, and as the years went by without any trace of Jessica, her suspicions grew stronger. We stopped talking about anything meaningful, stopped sharing a bedroom, stopped having any kind of normal married life. Their divorce in 2006 had been inevitable, though both of them had been reluctant to admit that their marriage couldn't survive the trauma of Jessica's disappearance. Patricia had moved back to town to be closer to her mother and to make it easier to coordinate search efforts with law enforcement and volunteer groups. Bill had remained at the country house, partly because he couldn't afford to maintain 2 residences and partly because he felt compelled to stay near Jessica's grave. "I wanted to confess so many times over the years," Bill said, his breathing becoming increasingly difficult as the emotional strain of his confession took its toll. "Especially when Patricia and I were getting divorced, I came close to telling her everything. She was blaming herself for Jessica's disappearance, thinking she had been a bad mother who had failed to protect her child. I knew that telling her the truth would hurt her terribly, but I also thought it might free her from the guilt she was carrying." The detective asked why Bill had ultimately chosen to maintain his silence for so many years, even as he watched his ex-wife suffer. He explained that each year that passed had made the truth seem more impossible to reveal, and that he had convinced himself that Patricia was better off with hope than with the devastating reality of what had actually happened to her daughter. "I told myself that as long as she believed Jessica might still be alive somewhere, she had hope," Bill said. "If I told her that Jessica was dead and had been dead all these years, buried in our barn like some kind of animal, it would destroy her completely. I thought I was protecting her, but now I realize I was just protecting myself from having to face the consequences of what I'd done." As the afternoon light continued to fade outside the farmhouse windows, Detective Castellanos worked to gather all the specific details she would need for the investigation that would follow Bill's confession. He provided precise information about the location of Jessica's grave, 8 feet from the back wall of the barn, 4 feet from the corner post, buried approximately 5 feet deep beneath a section of the dirt floor that he had carefully maintained over the years to avoid arousing suspicion. "There's a distinctive knot in one of the barn's support beams directly above where I buried her," Bill said, pointing toward the window that faced the old building. "I used that knot as a marker so I would always know exactly where she was. Sometimes, especially on the anniversary of her death, I would go out there and just stand in that spot, trying to find the courage to dig her up and call the police." The detective asked about Bill's decision to finally come forward after nearly 24 years of silence. He explained that his terminal cancer diagnosis had forced him to confront his own mortality and the weight of the secret he had been carrying. The prospect of dying without ever revealing the truth about Jessica's fate had become unbearable, especially as he imagined Patricia spending the rest of her life wondering what had happened to her daughter. "I realized that I was going to die, knowing that Patricia would never have closure, never know what happened to Jessica, never be able to properly mourn her daughter or visit her grave," Bill said, his voice barely audible now. "Jessica deserves a proper burial in the town cemetery next to her real father, and Patricia deserves to know the truth about what happened, even if it comes too late for either of them to have peace from it." As the official interview concluded, Detective Castellanos felt a complex mixture of satisfaction, sadness, and anger. Jessica's disappearance would finally be solved after nearly a quarter-century of mystery, but the resolution brought no joy, only the tragic reality of a young life cut short by a moment of panic and poor judgment, followed by decades of deception that had caused immeasurable additional suffering for everyone involved. The following morning, brought a flurry of activity to the remote property that had kept its secret for 24 years. A team of forensic investigators arrived from the State Crime Lab with ground-penetrating radar equipment, excavation tools, and everything needed to properly recover human remains that had been buried for more than 2 decades. Detective Castellanos coordinated with the county medical examiner's office and began the difficult process of notifying Patricia and other family members that Jessica's case had been resolved in the most tragic way possible. Bill, despite his rapidly failing health and dependence on supplemental oxygen, insisted on being present as the forensic team began their work in the old barn. He sat in a folding chair near the entrance, his oxygen tank hissing softly beside him, watching as decades of deception were literally brought to light. The barn, which had stood as a silent monument to his terrible secret for nearly a quarter century, was about to give up the truth that had been hidden beneath its dirt floor since that October Sunday in 1999. The forensic team worked methodically throughout the morning, using ground-penetrating radar to confirm the presence of disturbed soil and possible human remains in the exact location Bill had described. The radar images showed clear evidence of a burial site that matched his account in both size and depth, lending credibility to his confession and providing investigators with the confidence to begin excavation. Detective Castellanos made the most difficult phone call of her career when she contacted Patricia Brennan, now 59 years old and working as a nurse supervisor at Denver General Hospital. Patricia had never remarried after her divorce from Bill, devoting much of her free time to missing persons advocacy and maintaining a website dedicated to finding Jessica that she updated regularly with any new information or developments in the case. Mrs. Brennan, this is Detective Maria Castellanos with the Clearwater County Sheriff's Department, she began, her voice carefully professional despite the emotional weight of what she had to communicate. I'm calling about Jessica's case. We've had a significant development that I need to discuss with you. Patricia's reaction to the news that Bill had confessed and that they believed they had found Jessica's remains was heartbreaking in its complexity. Relief at finally having answers mixed with overwhelming grief at learning that her daughter had been dead all these years, rage at Bill's deception, and a crushing sense of guilt that she had somehow failed to protect Jessica from the very person she had trusted to help raise her. I always knew he was lying about something, Patricia said through tears that had been building for 24 years. A mother knows when someone isn't telling her the complete truth about her child. I just never imagined. I never thought he would hurt her, and then let me spend all these years thinking she might walk through my door someday. The excavation of Jessica's grave began in the early afternoon, with Bill watching from his chair as the forensic team carefully removed layers of soil and debris that had accumulated over the decades. The work was painstaking and methodical, with every shovelful of dirt being sifted for evidence and every stage of the process being photographed and documented for the legal proceedings that would follow. By late afternoon, the team had uncovered the first pieces of physical evidence that corroborated Bill's account. The blue blanket he had described was found first, its fabric preserved by the dry Montana soil and the protection of the barn structure above. Within the blanket, they discovered Jessica's skeletal remains, along with the silver locket that had been her father's last gift to her, her weekend clothing, and the small backpack she had brought to the country house that final time. The medical examiner who responded to the scene was Dr. Amanda Foster, a forensic pathologist who had worked on hundreds of cases involving suspicious deaths and human remains recovery. Her preliminary examination of Jessica's skull revealed a fracture pattern consistent with Bill's description of her falling backward and striking the kitchen counter. The angle and location of the injury supported his claim that her death had been accidental, though the legal consequences of his subsequent actions would be severe regardless of the circumstances surrounding Jessica's initial injury. Patricia arrived from Denver the following day, accompanied by her sister Margaret and a victim services coordinator from the district attorney's office. She had specifically requested the opportunity to confront Bill in person, to hear directly from him why he had allowed her to suffer for 24 years without knowing what had happened to her daughter. Detective Castellanos arranged for the meeting to take place in the Sheriff's Department conference room, with herself and a prosecutor present as witnesses to ensure that everything was properly documented. Bill, now visibly weakened by the stress of the past few days and barely able to speak above a whisper due to his advancing illness, struggled to maintain eye contact with his former wife as she entered the room. He was connected to a portable oxygen concentrator and had a blanket draped over his shoulders, despite the warm temperature, looking every bit like a man who was rapidly approaching the end of his life. "Patricia, I know you can never forgive me for what I've done," Bill began, but she immediately cut him off with a gesture that was both firm and filled with barely controlled rage. "Don't you dare ask for my forgiveness," she said, her voice shaking with emotion that had been building for nearly a quarter of a century. "You took my daughter away from me, and then you watched me destroy myself with worry and false hope for 24 years. You sat in our living room while I cried myself to sleep every night. You listened to me blame myself for not being a good enough mother, and you never said a word." The confrontation lasted nearly 2 hours, with Patricia demanding to know every detail of Jessica's final moments and Bill's decision-making process in the hours and days that followed her death. She wanted to understand how he could have lived with himself all these years, how he could have watched her spend their life savings on private investigators and search efforts, how he could have remained silent during their divorce when she was convinced that she had somehow failed as a mother. "I need you to tell me exactly what happened in those final minutes," Patricia demanded, her voice breaking with grief. "I need to know if she suffered, if she was afraid, if she called for me. I've spent 24 years imagining every possible scenario, and now I need to know the truth, no matter how much it hurts." Bill answered every question she asked, no matter how painful or accusatory, accepting full responsibility for both Jessica's accidental death and his decision to conceal it for so many years. He described their argument in detail, explained exactly how she had fallen and struck her head, and assured Patricia that Jessica's death had been instantaneous and that she had not suffered. "She was angry with me, but she wasn't afraid," Bill said, his voice barely audible. "The last thing she said to me was that her real father would never have treated her the way I did. She was right about that, Patricia. David would have been a much better father to her than I ever was, and she would probably still be alive today if you had never married me." Patricia's response was measured but devastating in its emotional impact. "Jessica was 15 years old when she died, Bill. She should have graduated from high school, gone to college, fallen in love, gotten married, had children of her own. Instead, she spent 24 years in an unmarked grave in your barn, mourned by people who didn't even know she was dead. You robbed her of her future, and you robbed me of the chance to properly grieve my daughter." The weight of Patricia's words hung heavy in the conference room as Bill struggled to respond through his labored breathing and overwhelming guilt. "I know I can never make this right," he whispered. "I've destroyed so many lives with my cowardice, not just Jessica's and yours, but everyone who loved her and spent years wondering what happened. I've been a coward for 24 years, and I'm still a coward now, only coming forward because I'm dying and can't take this secret to my grave." Patricia stood up abruptly, her hands shaking as she gathered her purse and jacket. "The only thing you can do now is make sure that every detail of what happened is documented so that Jessica can finally be properly laid to rest. She deserves to be buried next to her father in Cedar Falls Cemetery, where people who loved her can visit her grave and remember the bright, beautiful girl she was before you took her life away. As Patricia prepared to leave the room, she turned back to face Bill one final time. "I hope the guilt has eaten you alive for all these years, Bill. I hope you've suffered every single day, because that's what you put me through. The difference is, I suffered because I loved my daughter and missed her terribly. You suffered because you were too selfish and cowardly to face the consequences of your actions." Bill died 7 weeks later in the hospice unit at Clearwater County Hospital, never making it to trial for the charges that had been filed against him. The district attorney had prepared cases for involuntary manslaughter, tampering with evidence, and abuse of a corpse. But Bill's confession, his cooperation in recovering Jessica's remains, and his terminal condition had influenced the decision not to pursue the case aggressively against a dying man. His death certificate listed lung cancer as the primary cause, but those who knew the full story believed he had died from the accumulated weight of 24 years of guilt and the devastating impact of finally telling the truth. The funeral arrangements became a source of unexpected controversy in Cedar Falls. Bill had left instructions in his will that his body should be cremated and his ashes scattered on the mountain property where he had lived for so many years. But Patricia and several community members objected to this plan. They argued that Bill didn't deserve to have his final resting place anywhere near the location where Jessica had died and been secretly buried for over 2 decades. Ultimately, Bill's distant relatives from Billings claimed his body and arranged for a private burial in a cemetery outside of town, with no funeral service and no public announcement of his death. The local newspaper ran a brief obituary that mentioned his work with the county road department and his marriage to Patricia, but made no reference to his role in Jessica's disappearance or the confession that had finally solved the case. Jessica's funeral took place on a cold December morning in Cedar Falls, exactly 24 years and 2 months after her disappearance. The service drew hundreds of people from the community and beyond. Former classmates who were now adults with children of their own, teachers who had never forgotten their missing student, law enforcement officers who had worked on the case over the years, and families of other missing persons who understood the unique pain of not knowing what had happened to a loved one. Patricia had chosen to bury Jessica next to her biological father, David, in the Cedar Falls Cemetery, finally bringing her daughter home to rest beside the man who had been the love of her short life. The grave marker was made of simple grey granite, inscribed with Jessica's name and dates, along with a quote from one of her favorite poems. "Though she be but little, she is fierce." Below that, Patricia had added, "Beloved daughter, never forgotten, finally at peace." The funeral service was held at Cedar Falls Community Church, the same building where Jessica had been baptized as a child and where she had sung in the youth choir before the family tensions surrounding Bill's arrival had caused her to stop attending regularly. Pastor Michael Hendricks, who had known Jessica since she was a little girl, delivered a eulogy that celebrated her life while acknowledging the tragedy of her death and the additional suffering caused by decades of deception. "Jessica Brennan was taken from us far too soon, not once, but twice," Pastor Hendricks said, his voice carrying across the packed sanctuary. "First, when her life was ended by accident and poor judgment 24 years ago. And second, when the truth about her death was hidden from those who loved her, denying them the opportunity to properly mourn her loss and celebrate her memory." Detective Castellanos attended the funeral, standing in the back of the church, as Patricia delivered a eulogy that captured both her devastating grief and her determination to ensure that Jessica's story would serve some greater purpose. "My daughter was 15 years old when she died," Patricia said, her voice strong despite the tears streaming down her face. "She loved animals and wanted to be a veterinarian. She was learning to drive and was excited about getting her license. She had a crush on a boy named Tommy Rodriguez and was looking forward to homecoming dance. She was a normal teenager with dreams and plans and a whole life ahead of her. Patricia's voice broke as she continued. Instead of living that life, Jessica spent 24 years in an unmarked grave, hidden away from everyone who loved her. But today, we bring her home. Today, we finally get to say goodbye properly. Today, we get to tell her how much we've missed her and how sorry we are that we couldn't protect her. In the months following Jessica's funeral, Patricia threw herself into advocacy work for missing persons cases and the families who suffer through the agony of not knowing what happened to their loved ones. She established the Jessica Brennan Foundation for Missing Children, which provides resources and support for families dealing with disappearances and funds training programs for law enforcement officers in small communities that might lack the resources or experience to properly handle complex missing persons investigations. Patricia often speaks at conferences and training seminars about the devastating impact of unresolved cases, not just on immediate family members, but on entire communities that are left to wonder and worry about the safety of their own children. Her presentations always include photographs of Jessica at various ages, showing the bright, happy child she had been before the family dynamics shifted with Bill's arrival, and the promising young woman she was becoming before her life was tragically cut short. The families of missing persons live in a special kind of hell, Patricia tells audiences of law enforcement officers, victim advocates, and other families dealing with similar tragedies. We can't properly grieve because we don't know if our loved one is dead or alive. We can't move forward because we're always waiting for that phone call that will bring them home. We can't find peace because every day brings new questions and new fears about what might have happened. The country house where Jessica died was demolished at Patricia's request, with the county agreeing to purchase the property and convert it into a memorial park dedicated to missing children. Patricia couldn't bear the thought of another family living in the place where her daughter had spent her final moments, and the community supported her desire to ensure that the property would serve a more meaningful purpose than housing new residents who might be unaware of its tragic history. The memorial park features a small playground for children, walking trails through the mountain meadows where Jessica had once loved to explore, and a simple granite monument inscribed with the names of missing children from across Montana. The centerpiece of the park is a bench positioned to look out over the valley toward Cedar Falls, with a plaque that reads, "In memory of Jessica Brennan and all children who have been lost. May their stories be remembered and their families find peace." Detective Castellanos continues to work cold cases in Clearwater County, carrying with her the lessons learned from Jessica's case about the importance of thorough initial investigations and the need to look beyond the obvious explanations when someone disappears. She has implemented new protocols for missing persons cases that require more comprehensive searches of properties and more detailed documentation of all evidence and witness statements. The case has become a training tool for law enforcement agencies across Montana and the surrounding states, illustrating how family dynamics, community assumptions, and resource limitations can combine to create investigative blind spots that allow important evidence to be overlooked for decades. Police academies now use Jessica's case as an example of how persistent follow-up and compassionate interviewing techniques can sometimes unlock secrets that have been buried for years. Jessica's former classmates, now adults with teenagers of their own, have created an annual scholarship in her memory for students who plan to pursue careers in veterinary medicine. The Jessica Brennan Memorial Scholarship is awarded each spring to a graduating senior from Cedar Falls High School who demonstrates both academic excellence and a commitment to animal welfare, ensuring that Jessica's childhood dream of becoming a veterinarian continues to inspire young people, even though she never had the chance to pursue that goal herself. Tommy Rodriguez, the boy Jessica had been excited to dance with at the homecoming she never attended, became a teacher and coach at Cedar Falls High School after college. He often speaks to his students about the importance of treating each day as precious and making sure the people they care about know how much they mean to them. You never know when someone might be taken away from you, he tells them, so don't waste time on anger or petty disagreements that don't really matter in the long run. The barn where Jessica's remains were hidden for 24 years was also demolished as part of the Memorial Park development, but not before Patricia spent several hours there alone, sitting in the exact spot where her daughter had been buried. She later described the experience as both heartbreaking and healing, finally being able to visit the place where Jessica had rested for so many years, and to say the goodbye that had been denied to her for over 2 decades. I told her how sorry I was that I couldn't protect her, Patricia said in an interview with the local newspaper. I told her how much I had missed her every single day and how proud I was of the beautiful young woman she was becoming. I promised her that I would make sure her story was remembered and that other families wouldn't have to suffer the way we did. The story of Jessica Brennan's disappearance and the 24-year wait for truth serves as a powerful reminder that secrets, no matter how deeply buried, have a way of eventually coming to light. Bill's deathbed confession brought closure to a case that had haunted a community for nearly a quarter century, but it also highlighted the ripple effects of tragedy and deception on everyone touched by such events. Today, the Memorial Park that stands where the Garrett property once existed serves as a place of reflection and remembrance for anyone who has lost a child or loved one to violence, accident, or disappearance. Visitors often leave flowers at Jessica's memorial bench, and Patricia makes regular trips from Denver to maintain the gardens and walking trails that honor her daughter's memory. The case files from Jessica's disappearance and eventual discovery are now part of the required curriculum at the Montana Law Enforcement Academy, teaching future investigators about the importance of persistence, the complexity of family dynamics in missing persons cases, and the healing power of truth, even when it comes decades too late for those who suffered while waiting for answers. In her victim impact statement, which was read into the court record even though Bill had died before facing trial, Patricia wrote, "My daughter Jessica was denied the chance to live her life, but she was also denied the dignity of a proper death and burial. For 24 years, she lay in an unmarked grave while her family searched desperately for any sign of what had happened to her. While I can never forgive the man who took her from us twice, once through his actions and once through his silence, I can find some peace in knowing that she is finally home where she belongs, surrounded by the love of those who never stopped believing in her and never stopped fighting to bring her home." The inscription on Jessica's gravestone, visible from the road that runs through Cedar Falls Cemetery, serves as a daily reminder to everyone in the community about the preciousness of life and the importance of truth. Patricia chose those particular words. Though she be but little, she is fierce, not only because they came from one of Jessica's favorite Shakespeare quotes, but because they captured the strength and determination that Jessica had shown throughout her short life, and the fierce love that had driven her family's 24-year search for answers. As Detective Castellanos often tells the law enforcement officers she trains, every missing person case represents a family in crisis, a community in fear, and a life that matters to someone. We owe it to the victims and their families to never give up, never assume we know the whole story, and never stop believing that the truth can still be found, no matter how much time has passed or how hopeless the case might seem.